Amidst the raging storm on the mountain, Ethan Cole clung to the shaking rafters, blood streaming down his arms as the wind nearly ripped him off the roof. Below, Victoria Hale screamed, desperately trying to hold on to the structure they had built with sweat and hope. Only 3 days remained before the bank seized everything. 3 days to prove that a man burdened by past debt and a woman who had lost everything could rebuild what the world believed impossible. But before that, before the storm, before everything crumbled and rose again, there were 30 days. 30 days to change everything. If you want to know how they accomplished the impossible, follow this story to the very end. And don't forget to like and comment where you're watching from so I know how far this story has come. The truck rattled over the last stretch of gravel, every pothole sending a jolt through the frame. Ethan Cole kept both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the narrow mountain road ahead. The late afternoon sun cut through the pines at an angle that made everything look sharper than it was. Harder. He'd driven this route twice before, both times to tell someone their project was dead. This would be the third. Behind him, in the back seat, his daughter Maya hummed something off-key, her headphones blasting music he couldn't hear. She was 11 now. Old enough to know when her dad was tense, old enough not to ask why. The job had been a disaster from the start. A barn restoration, high in the Cascades, miles from anything resembling civilization. The original contractor had walked off 2 weeks in, citing impossible conditions and unrealistic expectations. The second guy lasted 3 days. Ethan had been called in as a last resort, which usually meant the client was either desperate or delusional. Sometimes both. He rounded the final curve and the property opened up in front of him. It was worse than he'd expected. The barn sat in a clearing carved out of dense forest, its frame sagging under decades of neglect. Half the roof was missing. The south wall leaned inward at an angle that defied physics. Rusted tools and rotted lumber littered the ground like the aftermath of a small war. Someone had tried to shore up the foundation with concrete blocks, but they'd cracked under the weight, leaving jagged gaps where rainwater pooled. Ethan exhaled slowly. This wasn't a restoration project. It was a demolition waiting to happen. He parked near the edge of the clearing and killed the engine. Maya pulled off her headphones. "Is that it?" she asked. "Yeah. It looks like it's going to fall over." "It might." She studied the barn for a moment, then shrugged. "Cool." Ethan climbed out, boots crunching on gravel. The air smelled like pine sap and wet earth. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a chainsaw buzzed, then stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. A woman stood near the barn's entrance, arms crossed, watching him approach. She was younger than he'd expected. 30, maybe. Dark hair pulled back tight, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that looked brand new. Her boots were expensive, the kind people wore when they wanted to look like they worked with their hands but never actually did. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "Victoria Hale?" "That's me." Her voice was clipped, professional. "You're Ethan Cole." "I am." She looked past him toward the truck. "You brought your daughter?" "Didn't have a choice. Her sitter canceled." Victoria's gaze flicked back to him. "This isn't a daycare." "I'm aware." Ethan kept his tone flat. He'd dealt with clients like this before. Rich. Used to getting their way. "You want me to look at the barn or not?" Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Let's walk." They crossed the clearing in silence. Up close, the barn was even worse. The main support beams had rotted through in places, leaving gaps where you could see straight through to the other side. The floor was a patchwork of broken planks and exposed dirt. Every step felt like a gamble. Victoria stopped near the center. "My father built this 40 years ago. He used it to store equipment when he was logging up here. When he died, the property went to the bank. I bought it back 6 months ago." Ethan crouched down, running his hand along one of the lower beams. The wood crumbled under his fingers. "Why?" "Because it's mine." "That's not an answer." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something other than control in her expression. Something raw. "It's the only thing I have left of him. Everything else is gone." Ethan stood, brushing wood dust off his hands. "You know what it'll take to fix this, right? The foundation's shot, the framing's compromised, half the materials are rotted through. You're not restoring a barn. You're rebuilding one from scratch." "I know." "And you've got 30 days before the bank forecloses." "I know that too." "Then you also know it's impossible." Victoria's eyes didn't waver. The first two contractors said the same thing. They quit. You're still here. I'm here to tell you it's not worth it. I didn't ask for your opinion. Her voice sharpened. I asked if you could do it. Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was something in the way she stood, shoulders back, chin up, that reminded him of people who'd never been told no. But underneath that, buried deeper, was something else. Desperation. The kind that made people do stupid things. He should walk away. He had a dozen other jobs lined up. Smaller, easier. Projects that wouldn't drain his crew or cost him sleep. But something about the way she looked at the barn, like it was the only thing holding her together, made him pause. I'll need to see the plans, he said finally. Victoria pulled a folder from her bag and handed it to him. Inside were blueprints, permits, inspection reports. Everything was in order, too much in order, like she'd spent months preparing for this and refused to believe it wouldn't work. Ethan flipped through the pages, his mind already calculating costs, timelines, labor. It was tight, tighter than anything he'd done before. But if he cut corners, used prefab materials, doubled shifts, pulled in favors, it might be possible. Might. He closed the folder. I'll do it. But I need full control. No interference, no second guessing. You hired me to rebuild this thing, so let me rebuild it. Fine. And I need half up front, the rest when we pass inspection. Victoria nodded. Done. One more thing. Ethan glanced back toward the truck, where Maya was sitting on the tailgate, swinging her legs. My daughter stays with me. I can't leave her alone, and I'm not putting her in some random motel 30 miles away. She'll stay out of the way, but she's here. Victoria hesitated. For a second, he thought she'd refuse. Then she nodded again. As long as she doesn't slow you down. She won't. They shook hands. Her grip was firm, cold. Ethan turned and walked back toward the truck, the folder tucked under one arm. Maya hopped down as he approached. So? We staying? Yeah. For how long? 30 days. She grinned. That's a lot of days. It is. Think we can do it? Ethan looked back at the barn, its broken frame silhouetted against the fading light. We'll find out. The first 3 days were a bloodbath. Ethan brought in a crew of 4, guys he'd worked with for years, reliable and fast. They started by clearing out the debris, hauling rotted wood and rusted metal into a burn pile at the edge of the property. The work was slow. Every board they pulled revealed another problem. Termites in the joists, water damage in the subfloor, cracks in the foundation that ran deeper than anyone had expected. Victoria showed up every morning at 6, dressed like she was ready to work, but clearly having no idea where to start. She hovered near the edges, asking questions, taking notes, trying to look useful. Ethan ignored her. He had enough to worry about without babysitting a billionaire-playing construction worker. On the 3rd day, one of his crew, a guy named Torres, pulled him aside. We've got a problem, Torres said, nodding toward the south wall. That whole section's unstable. If we try to rebuild around it, the weight's going to collapse the foundation. Ethan walked over, inspecting the damage. Torres was right. The wall wasn't just leaning, it was failing. If they didn't tear it down and start over, the entire structure would be compromised. How long to rebuild it? Ethan asked. 3 days, maybe 4. We don't have 4 days. Then we're screwed. Ethan stared at the wall, jaw tight. He could feel the weight of the timeline pressing down on him. 30 days had seemed impossible from the start. Now it felt like a joke. Victoria appeared beside him. What's the problem? South wall's a loss, Ethan said. We need to tear it down and rebuild from scratch. That's 3 days we don't have. Then we work faster. He turned to look at her. It doesn't work like that. Why not? Because physics doesn't care how motivated you are. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You said you could do this. I said I'd try. That's not good enough. Ethan took a step closer, his voice dropping. You want to know what's not good enough? Throwing money at a problem and expecting it to fix itself. This barn is falling apart because someone didn't maintain it, because someone let it rot for 40 years. You can't undo that in 30 days just because you're rich and stubborn. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she turned and walked toward the wall, crouching down to inspect the base. What if we reinforce it instead of rebuilding? Won't work. The foundation's too weak. What if we pour new concrete around it, shore it up from the outside? Ethan frowned. It wasn't a terrible idea. risky, but faster than a full rebuild. That might buy us time, but if the inspector sees it, he'll flag it. Then we make sure he doesn't see it. That's not how inspections work. Victoria stood, brushing dirt off her hands. I'll handle the inspector. You handle the wall. Ethan studied her, trying to figure out if she was serious. You're talking about bribing a county official. I'm talking about making sure this project passes inspection, however that needs to happen. I don't work like that. Then you're going to lose. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't, because she wasn't. He exhaled slowly. Fine, we reinforce the wall, but if this blows up, it's on you. It won't. By the end of the first week, the barn had started to take shape. The debris was cleared, the foundation was reinforced. The south wall stood, barely, but it stood. Ethan's crew worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, pushing through exhaustion and frustration. Victoria was there every morning, and despite Ethan's initial doubts, she didn't just watch. She learned. At first, it was small things, handing tools to the crew, organizing materials, fetching water when someone needed it. But by day 5, she was swinging a hammer. By day 7, she was cutting boards. She was clumsy, inefficient, and slow. But she didn't quit. Ethan found her one evening after the crew had left, standing alone in the barn with a measuring tape and a notepad. She was taking measurements, her face scrunched in concentration. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Checking the alignment on the east wall. Torres said it was off by half an inch." "It is. We're fixing it tomorrow." "I wanted to see for myself." Ethan leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "You don't trust us?" "I trust you. I just don't trust that this is going to work." "Then why are you here?" Victoria lowered the measuring tape, finally meeting his eyes. "Because if I'm not, it definitely won't." He didn't have an answer for that. The first real problem came on day 9. A man showed up unannounced, driving a county vehicle with an inspection decal on the door. He was in his 50s, overweight, with a clipboard and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan met him at the edge of the clearing. "Can I help you?" "County building inspector," the man said, flashing a badge. "I'm here to check your progress." "We're not scheduled for an inspection until day 28. This is a preliminary review, making sure everything's up to code before you get too far along." Ethan's jaw tightened. Preliminary reviews weren't standard. Someone had sent this guy early. "Who requested this?" The inspector shrugged. "I don't ask questions. I just do my job." Victoria appeared from inside the barn, her face calm but her eyes sharp. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," the inspector said. "Just doing my due diligence." He walked past them, clipboard in hand, inspecting every corner of the site. He checked the foundation, the framing, the materials. He took pictures, made notes, asked questions that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with slowing them down. When he finally finished, he turned to Victoria. "You're behind schedule." "We're on track," she said evenly. "Not according to my assessment. The south wall's unstable. The foundation's been patched instead of properly repaired. If I come back for the final inspection and it's not perfect, you're not passing." "It will be perfect." The inspector smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "We'll see." He left without another word. Ethan waited until the truck disappeared down the road before turning to Victoria. "Who did you piss off?" "A lot of people." She folded her arms. "There's a developer who wants this land. He's been trying to buy it for years. When I outbid him, he didn't take it well. So he sent the inspector to sabotage us." "Probably." "Great." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "We're already behind. If he comes back early again, he'll find something. He'll make sure we fail." Victoria's expression didn't change. "Then we don't give him anything to find." The next 2 weeks were a blur. Ethan pushed the crew harder than he ever had. They worked through rain, through cold, through exhaustion. Materials arrived late, tools broke, injuries happened. Nothing serious, but enough to slow them down. Every day felt like a fight. Every small victory was followed by 2 setbacks. Maya adapted better than Ethan expected. She spent her days exploring the woods, sketching in her notebook, helping Victoria organize supplies. At night, she and Ethan would sit by a campfire near the truck, eating canned soup and talking about nothing important. It was the most time they'd spent together in months. One night, she looked up at him, her face lit by the firelight. "Do you think we're going to finish?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but you're trying." "Yeah, that's what matters, right?" Ethan looked at her, this kid who'd been through more than any 11-year-old should have to go through, and felt something tighten in his chest. "Yeah, that's what matters." By day 20, the barn was almost unrecognizable. The frame stood solid, the roof was intact, the walls were plumb. Inside, the new flooring gleamed under the overhead lights. It wasn't finished. There were still details to handle, trim to install, final coats of stain to apply. But it was close. Victoria stood in the center, turning slowly, taking it all in. For the first time since Ethan had met her, she looked something other than tense. She looked proud. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. "It's not done." "I know, but it's beautiful anyway." He didn't argue. That night, the crew left early, exhausted but optimistic. Ethan stayed behind, walking through the barn one more time, checking every joint, every seam. Everything had to be perfect. No room for error. Victoria was still there when he finished, sitting on the front steps, staring out at the darkening forest. "You should get some rest," Ethan said, walking over. "So should you." "I will." She looked up at him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not quitting." Ethan shrugged. "You paid me not to." "It's more than that." She stood, brushing dust off her jeans. "You could have walked away a dozen times. You didn't." "Neither did you." Victoria smiled. It was a small smile, tired and real. "No, I didn't." Dimmed. Day 23 brought the storm. It started as a light rain, nothing unusual for the mountains. But by midday, the wind had picked up and the clouds turned black. By evening, it was a full-blown gale. Ethan sent the crew home early, but he stayed. The roof wasn't fully secured yet. If the wind got under it, the whole thing could tear apart. He climbed up with a hammer and a bag of nails, working as fast as he could while the rain pounded down. Victoria appeared below, shouting over the wind. "Get down! It's not safe! I'm almost done! Ethan, get down!" A gust hit hard, and the roof shifted. Ethan lost his footing, his hand slipping on the wet wood. He grabbed for the nearest beam, felt it give, and then he was falling. He hit the scaffolding hard, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. Pain shot through his side. He tried to get up, but his leg wouldn't move. Victoria was there a second later, pulling him off the scaffolding, dragging him toward the shelter of the barn. Her hands were shaking, her face pale. "You idiot," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have died." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." She was right. His ribs were bruised, maybe cracked. His leg throbbed. But he was alive. They sat inside the barn, rain hammering the roof. And for the first time, Ethan let himself stop, let himself breathe. Victoria sat beside him, her shoulder pressed against his. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged on. The final week was chaos. The inspector came back twice, each time finding something new to complain about. The developer made an offer to buy the property, double what Victoria had paid, and when she refused, he threatened legal action. The crew was exhausted. Materials ran out, time ran out, but they kept going. On day 29, the barn was finished. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking at what they'd built. It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was proof. Proof that impossible things could happen if you refused to quit. Victoria walked up beside him. "We did it." "Yeah," Ethan said. "We did." The inspection was scheduled for tomorrow. One more day, one more fight. But tonight, they'd won. The morning of day 30 arrived cold and silent. Ethan woke before dawn, his ribs still aching from the fall, his hands stiff from weeks of work. He lay in the truck bed for a moment, listening to Maya's quiet breathing beside him, watching the first light filter through the trees. Today would decide everything. One inspection, one chance. He climbed out carefully, trying not to wake her, and walked toward the barn. The clearing was empty, the air sharp with the smell of fresh-cut wood and damp earth. The barn stood in the pale light like something that had always been there, solid and real. But Ethan knew better. He knew every weak point, every compromise, every corner they'd cut to make the deadline. He knew what the inspector would find if he looked hard enough. Victoria was already there, standing near the entrance with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face pale but composed. She poured coffee without asking and handed him a cup. "You're up early?" Ethan said. "Couldn't sleep." She took a sip, eyes fixed on the barn. "What time is he coming?" 8. "That gives us 2 hours." "To do what?" "It's done." Victoria turned to look at him. "Is it?" Ethan knew what she was asking. Not whether the work was finished, but whether it was good enough, whether they'd actually pulled it off or just built something that looked right from a distance. He wanted to tell her it was perfect, that they had nothing to worry about. But he'd never lied to a client before, and he wasn't going to start now. "I don't know," he said. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer. "Then we use the 2 hours to make sure." They walked through the barn together, checking everything one more time. The foundation was solid, the concrete reinforcement hidden beneath a layer of gravel and dirt. The south wall stood plumb, its internal bracing invisible from the outside. The floor was level, the roof secure, the electrical work up to code. Everything looked right. Everything felt right. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd missed something. At 7:30, Torres and the rest of the crew arrived. They'd cleaned up, shaved, dressed in clothes that didn't smell like sawdust and sweat. They looked professional, respectable, like people who knew what they were doing. Ethan had told them to take the day off, but they'd shown up anyway. "Figured you might need backup," Torres said, grinning. "Appreciate it." "We got this, boss. This barn's solid." Ethan wished he felt as confident. At 8 o'clock, the inspector's truck pulled into the clearing. The same man from before stepped out, clipboard in hand, expression unreadable. He didn't greet them, didn't make small talk. He just walked past them into the barn and started his inspection. Ethan stood outside with Victoria and the crew, waiting. The minutes stretched out like hours. Inside, they could hear the inspector moving around, tapping walls, checking joints, testing fixtures. Every sound felt like a verdict. Maya appeared beside Ethan, still half asleep, her hair a mess. "Is it happening?" "Yeah." "Are we going to pass?" "I hope so." She leaned against him, and he put an arm around her shoulders. They stood like that, watching the barn, waiting for the inspector to come out and tell them whether the last 30 days had meant anything. When the inspector finally emerged, his face gave nothing away. He walked over to where they were standing, flipping through pages on his clipboard, making notes. The silence was unbearable. "Well?" Victoria asked, her voice tight. The inspector looked up. "The foundation's been reinforced with external support. That's not standard." "It's structurally sound," Ethan said. "Maybe, but it's not what the original plans called for. The original plans were 40 years old. The foundation had failed. We adapted." The inspector made another note. "The south wall shows signs of previous instability. It's been fully braced. The load distribution is balanced. I'll need to verify that." Victoria stepped forward. "Are we passing or not?" The inspector studied her for a long moment. Then he looked back at his clipboard, flipping through pages, taking his time. Ethan could feel his pulse in his throat. This man had the power to destroy everything they'd built. One signature, and it was over. Finally, the inspector closed his clipboard. "The work meets code. Barely. But it meets code." Ethan felt something release in his chest. Beside him, Victoria exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 30 days. "So we pass?" she asked. "You pass." The inspector's expression didn't change. "But I'll be filing a report with the county about the foundation modifications. If there are any structural issues down the line, this won't hold up." "There won't be any issues," Ethan said. "We'll see." The inspector walked back to his truck, got in, and drove away. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Torres let out a whoop, and the rest of the crew started laughing, clapping each other on the back. Maya jumped up and down, grinning. Victoria stood perfectly still, staring at the barn like she didn't quite believe it was real. Ethan walked over to her. "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were wet. "I didn't think we'd actually do it." "Neither did I." "But we did." "Yeah, we did." She turned to look at him, and for the first time since they'd met, her guard was completely down. "Thank you." "You already said that." "I know, but I mean it." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Around them, the crew was already packing up tools, loading trucks, making plans to celebrate. The work was done. The fight was over. But something about the way Victoria looked at him made Ethan think the story wasn't finished yet. That afternoon, the crew left. They shook hands, collected their final paychecks, and drove off one by one until only Ethan, Maya, and Victoria remained. The clearing felt strange without the noise of construction, without the constant motion of people working. It felt too quiet. Victoria stood near the barn entrance, running her hand along the doorframe. "What happens now?" Ethan shrugged. "You do whatever you were planning to do with it." "I don't know what that is yet." "You spent 6 months fighting to keep it. You must have had a reason." She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "My father used to bring me here when I was a kid, before everything fell apart. Before he lost the business, before the drinking, before he died alone in a rented room 50 miles from here. This barn was the only place he was ever happy. I thought if I could save it, maybe I could save something of him too." Ethan understood that. The need to hold on to something, even when it didn't make sense, even when it hurt. "Did it work?" he asked. Victoria looked at the barn, then back at him. "I don't know yet." Maya wandered over, holding a piece of wood she'd picked up from the scrap pile. "Can I keep this?" "What for?" Ethan asked. "I want to build something." "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I want to try." Ethan looked at his daughter, at this kid who'd spent 30 days watching adults fight to make something out of nothing, and felt something shift inside him. "Yeah, you can keep it." Maya grinned and ran off toward the truck. Victoria watched her go. "She's a good kid." "She is. You're lucky." "I know." They stood in silence for a while, the sun starting to dip below the tree line. The shadows grew longer, the air cooler. Ethan knew he should leave, pack up the truck, get Maya home, move on to the next job, but he didn't move. "You staying here?" he asked. "For a while. I want to see what it feels like when it's quiet." "You need anything? You call me." "I will." Ethan turned to go, then stopped. "Victoria?" "Yeah?" "You did good. Your dad would be proud." She didn't say anything, but her eyes said enough. Ethan walked back to the truck, climbed in beside Maya, and started the engine. As they pulled away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Victoria was still standing there, alone in the clearing, looking at the barn like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. And maybe it was. The next morning, Ethan got the call he'd been dreading. He was at his office in town, going through paperwork, trying to catch up on the jobs he'd ignored for the past month. Maya was at school. Everything felt normal, boring even. Then his phone rang, and Victoria's name appeared on the screen. "What's wrong?" he answered. "The bank's filing a claim." Her voice was tight, controlled, but he could hear the panic underneath. "They're saying the inspection wasn't valid, that the modifications to the foundation violate the original loan agreement." Ethan sat up. "That's not how it works. We passed inspection. The work is done." "The developer's behind it. He's filed a complaint with the county saying we committed fraud. He's claiming the inspector was bribed." "Were you bribing him?" "No, but I talked to him. I made sure he understood what was at stake." "That's not a bribe." "It doesn't matter. The bank's using it as an excuse. They're moving forward with foreclosure." Ethan closed his eyes, jaw clenched. He'd known this was a possibility, that the developer wouldn't just give up, but he'd hoped passing the inspection would be enough. "What do you need?" he asked. "I don't know. A lawyer, maybe. Someone who can fight this." "How long do you have?" "A week? Maybe less." Ethan stood, grabbing his jacket. "I'm on my way." He hung up, locked the office, and drove straight to the property. The whole way there, his mind raced. This wasn't just about the barn anymore. It was about power, about a rich man who couldn't stand losing to someone who refused to back down. When he arrived, Victoria was standing outside the barn, staring at a stack of legal documents in her hands. She looked smaller than before, tired. "Let me see those," Ethan said, walking over. She handed them to him. He scanned the pages, his anger growing with every line. The claim was full of technical jargon and legal loopholes, but the intent was clear. The developer wanted the land, and he was willing to bury Victoria in paperwork until she gave up. "This is garbage," Ethan said. "Garbage that's legally binding. Not if we fight it. With what? I've already spent everything I have on this place. I can't afford a legal battle. Ethan looked at her, at the defeat creeping into her expression, and felt something harden inside him. He'd spent 30 days building this barn. He'd bled for it. He'd nearly died for it. He wasn't going to let some entitled developer tear it down because he could afford better lawyers. Then we don't fight it in court, Ethan said. What are you talking about? We fight it here. We make this so public, so loud, that the bank can't ignore it. Victoria frowned. How? You're a billionaire. You've got connections. Use them. I'm not a billionaire anymore. I was. Before I lost everything trying to save my father's company, this barn is all I have left. Ethan stared at her. You told me you bought this property back from the bank. I did, with the last of my money. So you're broke. Essentially, yes. He didn't know what to say to that. For the past month, he'd assumed she was just another rich person with too much money and not enough sense. But she wasn't. She was someone who'd lost everything and was fighting to hold on to the one thing that still mattered. Then we do this the hard way, Ethan said. Which is? We go to the media. We tell them what's happening. A local contractor and a woman trying to save her father's legacy being crushed by a corrupt developer. People love that story. Victoria shook her head. It won't work. The developer owns half the county. He's got politicians in his pocket. The media won't touch it. Then we make them. Over the next 3 days, Ethan and Victoria worked faster than they had during the entire restoration. They contacted local reporters, posted the story on social media, reached out to community groups. At first, no one cared. The story was too small, too local, but then a blogger picked it up. Then a regional news station. Then a national outlet. By day 4, the property was swarming with cameras. Ethan stood in front of the barn, microphone shoved in his face, and told the story. The 30-day deadline, the impossible conditions, the corrupt inspector, the developer trying to steal the land. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. Victoria stood beside him, calm and composed, answering questions about her father, about the barn, about why this mattered. She didn't play the victim. She didn't ask for sympathy. She just told the truth. And people listened. The developer tried to control the narrative, putting out statements claiming he was the real victim, that Victoria had violated building codes, that the whole project was a sham. But the photos of the barn told a different story. The interviews with Ethan's crew told a different story. The inspection report told a different story. On day 6, the bank issued a statement. They were suspending foreclosure proceedings pending further review. The developer's complaint was being investigated by the county. The inspector who'd signed off on the barn was being questioned. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a reprieve. That night, after the reporters had left and the cameras were gone, Ethan sat on the barn steps with Victoria. The clearing was quiet again, just the two of them and the sound of wind moving through the trees. You think it'll hold? Victoria asked. The barn or the legal case? Both. Ethan shrugged. The barn will hold. It's solid. The legal stuff, I don't know. Depends on how dirty the developer's willing to get. Pretty dirty, I'd guess. Probably. They sat in silence for a while. Then Victoria said, I owe you. Again. You don't owe me anything. I do. You didn't have to do any of this. Neither did you. She smiled, just a little. I didn't have a choice. Yeah, you did. You could have sold the land, walked away, started over somewhere else. Is that what you would have done? Ethan thought about it. About the jobs he'd walked away from over the years, the clients he'd refused, the projects he'd abandoned when they got too hard. And he realized he didn't know the answer. Maybe, he said. But you didn't. You stayed. So did you. Victoria looked at him, and something passed between them. Something that didn't need words, an understanding, a recognition of what they'd been through together. What happens when this is over? She asked. What do you mean? When the legal stuff is settled, when the barn's yours and the developer's gone, what happens then? Ethan didn't have an answer for that either. He'd spent so long focused on the next job, the next deadline, the next fight, that he'd forgotten how to think about what came after. I don't know, he said. Me neither. They sat there until the stars came out, two people who'd built something impossible and had no idea what to do with it now that it was done. The developer made his move on day 8. Ethan was at the property with Maya, showing her how to measure angles for a birdhouse she wanted to build. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Ethan Cole? The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, expensive. Yeah. My name is Richard Calloway. I represent Pinnacle Development Group. I believe you're familiar with our interest in the Hale property. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. I know who you are. Good. Then this will be simple. My client is prepared to offer you $50,000 to walk away from this project. No questions asked, no strings attached. Just take the money and move on. Not interested. Mr. Cole, I don't think you understand the situation. My client has significant resources. He can make this very difficult for you, for your business, for your family. Ethan's jaw clenched. Is that a threat? It's a reality. You're a contractor. You rely on permits, inspections, county approvals, all of which can be delayed, denied, made impossible. Or you can take the money and avoid all that unpleasantness. Tell your client to go to hell. Mr. Cole, Ethan hung up. Maya looked up from her birdhouse. Who was that? Nobody important, but his hands were shaking. He called Victoria immediately, told her about the offer, the threat, the lawyer's slick voice promising to destroy everything he'd built. What did you say? She asked. I told him no. Ethan, maybe you should think about it. $50,000 is a lot of money, and if they start going after your business, I'm not taking their money. Why not? Because if I do, they win, and I didn't spend 30 days breaking my back so some rich asshole could buy his way out of losing. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Okay. Okay? Yeah, okay. We fight. 2 days later, the permits for Ethan's next 3 projects were denied. No explanation, no justification, just denied. The day after that, 2 of his regular suppliers called to say they couldn't work with him anymore. Supply chain issues, they said. Nothing personal. The day after that, an anonymous complaint was filed with the state licensing board, claiming Ethan had violated safety regulations on a job from 2 years ago. The developer was making good on his threat. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the stack of rejection letters and complaints, feeling the walls close in. He'd built his business from nothing. 15 years of work, of reputation, of trust, and it was all coming apart. Maya found him there, late at night, head in his hands. Dad? He looked up. Hey, kiddo, you should be asleep. So should you. She walked over, climbed into the chair beside him. Are we in trouble? A little. Because of the barn? Yeah. Is it worth it? Ethan looked at his daughter, at her serious face and worried eyes, and realized she wasn't asking if the barn was worth it. She was asking if fighting was worth it. If standing up to people who had more power, more money, more everything was worth losing what they had. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think it has to be. Why? Because if we don't fight, we're saying it's okay for people to take things just because they can, and I don't want you growing up thinking that's how the world works. Maya nodded slowly. Okay. Okay? Yeah, let's fight. Ethan pulled her into a hug, holding on tight, and wondered if he was doing the right thing or just being stubborn. He still didn't know. The break came from an unexpected source. One of the reporters who'd covered the story called Ethan directly. She'd been digging into the developer's background and found something interesting. 3 other properties in the county where Pinnacle Development had pulled the same move. Buy land through foreclosure, force out the owners, flip it for profit. In 2 of those cases, county inspectors had filed false reports to justify the seizures. This is bigger than your barn, the reporter said. This is a pattern, and if we can prove it, the county's going to have to act. What do you need from me? Everything, documents, emails, recordings, anything that shows what they tried to do to you. Ethan had everything. He'd kept meticulous records, knowing that if this went to court, he'd need proof. He handed it all over. The story broke 3 days later. Front page. National coverage. The developer's name, his company, his connections, all laid out for everyone to see. The county opened an investigation. The state attorney general got involved. Politicians who'd taken money from Pinnacle Development suddenly refused to comment. The foreclosure was dropped. The complaint against Ethan was withdrawn. The permits were reinstated. It was over. Ethan stood in the barn, reading the news on his phone, and felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, just exhaustion. Victoria found him there an hour later. "We won." "Yeah. You don't sound happy." "I'm tired." She walked over, standing beside him. "Me too." They stood in silence, looking at the barn they'd fought so hard to save. It looked the same as it had on day 30. Solid. Real. But somehow different now, like it carried the weight of everything they'd been through. "What are you going to do with it?" Ethan asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe turn it into something, a workshop, a gallery, something that matters." "That sounds good. What about you?" Ethan shrugged. "Go back to work, catch up on the jobs I missed, try to rebuild what the developer tore down." "That's it? What else is there?" Victoria turned to face him. "You could stay." "Stay where?" "Here. Help me turn this place into something. We work well together." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You're serious?" "I am. I've got the space. You've got the skills. And I think we both know this isn't finished yet." "What isn't finished?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Ethan thought about his empty office, his stack of unfinished projects, his life that felt like a series of jobs with nothing in between. And he thought about the last 30 days. The fight. The work. The feeling of building something that mattered. "I'll think about it," he said. "Good." That night, Ethan lay in the truck bed with Maya, staring up at the stars. She was quiet, which usually meant she was thinking hard about something. "Dad? Yeah? Are we staying?" "I don't know, maybe. I think we should." "Why?" "Because you're different here. You're happier." Ethan looked at her. "You think so?" "Yeah. And I like it here. It's quiet. And Victoria's nice. And I want to finish my birdhouse." He laughed despite himself. "Those are good reasons. So we'll stay?" "We'll see." But looking up at the stars, listening to his daughter breathe beside him, Ethan thought maybe staying wasn't such a crazy idea after all. Ethan made his decision 3 days later, though he didn't tell Victoria right away. He spent those days finishing up loose ends in town, closing out the jobs he could salvage, apologizing to clients he'd had to abandon during the 30-day sprint. Some understood. Most didn't. By the time he was done, his business looked nothing like it had a month ago. Smaller, shakier, but still standing. Maya was thrilled when he told her they were going back to the mountain. She'd already packed her things before he'd even finished the sentence, stuffing clothes and books and the piece of scrap wood into a duffel bag like they were heading on an adventure instead of an uncertain partnership with a woman they barely knew. "How long are we staying?" Maya asked as they loaded the truck. "Don't know yet. Like a week? A month? However long it takes." "Takes to do what?" Ethan looked at his daughter, at her eager face and messy ponytail, and realized he didn't have a good answer. He didn't know what Victoria wanted to build, didn't know if they'd work well together outside the pressure of a deadline, didn't know if this was the smartest decision or the dumbest one he'd made in years. "Takes to figure out what comes next," he said finally. Maya grinned. "That's a terrible answer." "I know." They drove back up the mountain road in the late afternoon, the sun cutting through the trees at that same sharp angle that made everything look clearer than it was. The property appeared around the final curve, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest. The barn stood exactly as they'd left it, solid and quiet. Victoria's car was parked near the entrance, but she wasn't outside. Probably working on something inside, planning her next impossible project. Ethan parked beside her car and climbed out. Maya ran ahead, disappearing into the barn, calling Victoria's name. He followed more slowly, taking in the clearing, the forest beyond, the mountains rising in the distance. It was isolated up here, quiet in a way that could feel peaceful or suffocating depending on the day. He wondered which it would be. Inside, Victoria was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with blueprints spread out around her and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Maya was already beside her, asking 100 questions about the drawings. Victoria looked up when Ethan walked in. "You came back," she said. "Yeah." "Does that mean you're staying?" "For now." A smile flickered across her face, quick and genuine. "Good. I need your opinion on something. She gestured to the blueprints. Ethan walked over and crouched down, studying the plans. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. The barn was just the first piece. Victoria had drawn up plans for an entire compound, a workshop, living quarters, storage buildings, greenhouses. She was planning to turn the property into something self-sustaining, something that could generate income and provide work. What is this? Ethan asked. A timber collective. Small scale, sustainable. We harvest timber from the property, mill it here, sell it locally. We train people in traditional woodworking. We host workshops. We build furniture, structures, whatever people need. Ethan stared at the plans, his mind already calculating costs, timelines, labor. It was ambitious, bordering on crazy. Exactly the kind of project that would consume years of his life and probably break him in the process. This is going to take forever, he said. I know. And cost a fortune. I have some money left. Not much, but enough to start. You'll need more than money. You'll need a crew, equipment, permits. I know that too. Victoria looked at him directly. That's why I need you. Ethan picked up one of the blueprints, examining the details. The workshop alone would take months, the living quarters even longer. But the design was good, smart, efficient. Whoever had drawn this knew what they were doing. You draw these yourself? He asked. With help. I hired an architect to consult, but most of it's mine. It's solid work. Will you do it? Ethan looked at Maya, who was watching him with wide eyes, then back at Victoria. He thought about his empty office in town, his dwindling client list, the years stretching ahead with nothing to show for them but more of the same. And he thought about the last month, the feeling of building something that mattered, of working alongside someone who understood what it meant to fight for what you believed in. Yeah, he said. I'll do it. Victoria exhaled, relief washing over her face. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be brutal. I know. And we're going to fight, a lot. You're stubborn, and I'm an asshole, and neither of us backs down. I know that too. Good. Ethan stood, rolling up the blueprints. Then let's get started. They began work the next morning, starting with the workshop. It would serve as their base of operations, the place where they could mill timber and build furniture once everything was up and running. The design was straightforward, but required precision. Ethan brought in Torres and 2 other crew members, guys he trusted to work fast and clean. Victoria handled logistics, ordering materials, scheduling deliveries, keeping everything on track. The rhythm they'd developed during the barn restoration returned almost immediately. Ethan would assess the work, delegate tasks, troubleshoot problems. Victoria would anticipate needs before they arose, coordinate with suppliers, handle paperwork. They moved around each other efficiently, speaking in shorthand, finishing each other's thoughts. It should have felt awkward, this sudden partnership with someone he'd known for barely more than a month. But it didn't. Maya settled into a routine too. She'd help in the mornings, handing tools and organizing materials, then disappear into the woods with her notebook for hours. Sometimes she'd come back with sketches of birds or trees, sometimes with questions about angles and measurements. She was building something out there, though she wouldn't tell anyone what. 2 weeks in, Victoria pulled Ethan aside after the crew had left for the day. We need to talk about money, she said. Ethan had been expecting this conversation. How bad is it? Not terrible, but not great either. I budgeted for 6 months of construction. If we stay on schedule, we'll be fine. If we run into problems, we won't. We'll run into problems, we always do. I know. Victoria looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't used to admitting vulnerability. I just need you to know that if things get tight, I can't bail us out. This is it. What we have is what we have. Understood. And if we have to stop, we won't stop. Ethan, we won't stop, he repeated, his voice firm. We'll figure it out. We always do. Victoria studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. That night, Ethan lay awake in the small trailer he and Maya were renting at the edge of the property, running numbers in his head. The math was tight, tighter than he liked. One major setback and they'd be in trouble. But he'd been in trouble before. He'd figure it out. Beside him, Maya shifted in her sleep, mumbling something he couldn't make out. He looked at her in the darkness, this kid who trusted him completely, who believed they could do impossible things because he told her they could. The weight of that trust sat heavy on his chest. He couldn't fail her. He couldn't fail Victoria. He couldn't fail this. So he wouldn't. The first real problem hit in week 4. A shipment of lumber arrived warped and unusable. The supplier claimed it was fine when it left their yard, which meant it had been damaged in transit. The shipping company blamed the supplier. Neither would take responsibility, and neither would provide a replacement without payment. Ethan stood in the clearing looking at $6,000 worth of ruined wood and felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. Victoria appeared beside him. How bad? Bad. We can't use any of it. Can we get a refund? Eventually. But that'll take weeks and we need the lumber now. What if we source it locally? There's no local mill that can handle this volume. Then we build one. Ethan turned to look at her. What? We build a mill, a small one, just enough to process timber from the property. We were planning to do it eventually anyway. We just move up the timeline. That'll cost money we don't have. We have enough for the basics. A portable sawmill, some equipment. We can start small and expand later. Ethan ran the numbers in his head. It was risky. It would delay the workshop by at least a month. But if it worked, they'd have a steady source of materials and wouldn't have to rely on outside suppliers. It's a gamble, he said. Everything we've done is a gamble. He couldn't argue with that. They bought a used portable sawmill from a guy 3 counties over who was retiring. It was old and temperamental, but functional. Torres helped Ethan set it up at the edge of the clearing, running power from the barn's generator. Within a week, they were milling their own lumber, cutting boards from trees they'd felled on the property. It was slower than ordering from a supplier. Harder. But the wood was good, and it was theirs. Victoria stood watching the mill run one afternoon, arms crossed, a small smile on her face. We did it. Don't jinx it, Ethan said. This thing could break down tomorrow. It won't. How do you know? Because we won't let it. Ethan shook his head, but he was smiling too. Maya's project revealed itself in week 6. She'd been disappearing into the woods every day, sometimes for hours, always coming back with dirt under her nails and a secretive expression. When Ethan finally followed her one morning, he found a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the barn where she'd built a structure out of scrap wood and salvaged materials. It was a treehouse, sort of. More like a platform with walls and a partial roof, nestled between 3 large pines. The craftsmanship was rough, the measurements uneven, but it stood. She'd done it herself, without help, using nothing but hand tools and determination. Ethan stood at the base of the tree, looking up at what his daughter had built, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Dad? Maya's voice came from above. She was sitting on the platform, legs dangling over the edge. Are you mad? Why would I be mad? Because I used your tools without asking, and because I've been sneaking off. Ethan climbed up the ladder she'd cobbled together from branches and rope. When he reached the platform, he sat beside her, testing the structure. It was solid. Not perfect, but solid. I'm not mad, he said. I'm impressed. Really? Really, this is good work. Maya beamed. I wanted to build something too, like you and Victoria, something that was mine. You did. They sat in silence for a while, looking out through the trees. From up here you could see the barn, the workshop taking shape, the mountains beyond. It looked like something worth building, something worth fighting for. Dad, Maya said quietly, are we going to stay here, like, forever? I don't know about forever, but for a while, yeah. Good. I like it here. Me too, kiddo. I think Victoria likes having us here. Ethan glanced at his daughter. What makes you say that? She smiles more now, when you're around. She's just happy the work's going well. Maya gave him a look that was far too knowing for an 11-year-old. Sure, Dad, that's definitely it. Ethan wanted to argue, but he didn't. Because deep down, in a place he wasn't ready to examine too closely, he knew Maya was right. The workshop was finished in week 8, 3 days ahead of schedule. It stood beside the barn, its design echoing the older structure, but with modern touches. Large windows for natural light, high ceilings for ventilation, a concrete floor that could handle heavy equipment. It was exactly what they'd envisioned. They celebrated with cheap beer and pizza, sitting on the workshop floor while the crew told stories about close calls and stupid mistakes. Maya fell asleep leaning against Ethan's shoulder. Victoria sat across from them, laughing at Torres's exaggerated retelling of the day the sawmill had nearly thrown a blade. When the crew finally left and Maya had been carried to bed, Ethan and Victoria stood in the empty workshop, just the two of them and the smell of fresh sawdust. "It's beautiful," Victoria said softly. "It's a workshop. It's more than that." She walked to the center of the room, turning slowly. "This is the beginning of everything we're building here." Ethan watched her, this woman who'd been a stranger 2 months ago and was now the closest thing he had to a partner. She looked different than she had that first day. Stronger, more settled in her own skin. "Victoria," he said. She turned to face him. "Yeah?" He wanted to say something about what the last 2 months had meant, about how working beside her had changed something in him, about how he hadn't felt this alive in years. But the words wouldn't come, so he just said, "You did good." Her expression softened. "So did you." They stood there in the quiet workshop, the distance between them feeling both too far and too close. Finally, Victoria broke the moment, clearing her throat and checking her watch. "It's late. You should get some rest." "Yeah, you too." She nodded and headed for the door. Halfway there, she stopped and looked back. "Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for staying. You already thanked me." "I know, but I mean it." Then she was gone, leaving Ethan alone in the workshop with a feeling he couldn't quite name. The trouble started in week 9, and it came from a direction Ethan hadn't anticipated. A woman showed up at the property in an expensive car, dressed in business casual, carrying a leather folder. She introduced herself as Amanda Cole, Ethan's ex-wife. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, not since the divorce, not since she'd signed away custody and moved to Seattle with her new husband. Looking at her now, standing in the clearing like she had any right to be there, made his blood run cold. "What are you doing here, Yes?" he asked, his voice flat. "I came to see Maya." Amanda's tone was careful, practiced. "I heard you were living up here. I wanted to check on her." "She's fine. I'd like to see for myself." "No." Amanda's expression hardened. "Ethan, I have rights. You gave up your rights when you left. I still have visitation. The court order is very clear." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. "You haven't visited in 3 years. You haven't called. You haven't sent a birthday card. You don't get to show up now and pretend you care." "I do care. I've always cared. I just needed time to get my life together." "Well, Maya's life is together. Without you." Victoria appeared from the workshop, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. "Is everything okay?" Amanda turned to her, sizing her up. "And you are?" "Victoria Hale. I own this property." "I see." Amanda's gaze flicked between Victoria and Ethan, her expression calculating. "Are you living here too, Mr. Cole?" "That's none of your business." "It is if my daughter is living in unstable conditions." Ethan stepped forward, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You need to leave. Now." "I'll leave after I see Maya." "That's not happening. Then I'll get a court order." "Do it, and I'll fight you every step of the way." Amanda stared at him for a long moment, then glanced at the workshop, the barn, the clearing. "Living in the middle of nowhere with a woman you barely know. No stable housing, no permanent address. You really think a judge will side with you?" Before Ethan could respond, Maya's voice cut through the tension. "Mom?" Everyone turned. Maya stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale, confused. Amanda's expression softened immediately, slipping into something that looked almost genuine. "Hi, baby. I've missed you so much." Maya didn't move. She looked at Amanda like she was a stranger, which, Ethan realized, she basically was. "What are you doing here?" Maya asked. "I came to see you, to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine. Are you? Your father has you living in a trailer in the woods. That doesn't seem fine to me." "It's not a trailer, it's a rental, and I like it here." Amanda's smile faltered. "Sweetheart, you don't have to defend him. If you want to come stay with me in Seattle, you can. I have a house now, a real one, with your own room." Maya looked at her father, then back at Amanda. "I don't want to go to Seattle." "Maya, I want to stay here, with Dad, and Victoria." Amanda's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." Maya's voice was steady, stronger than Ethan had ever heard it. You left. You didn't want us. And that's okay. But you don't get to come back now and act like you care. For a moment, Amanda looked genuinely hurt. Then the mask slipped back into place, cold and hard. She turned to Ethan. This isn't over. Yeah, it is. Amanda walked back to her car, got in, and drove away without another word. The silence she left behind was suffocating. Maya walked over to Ethan, and he pulled her into a hug, holding on tight. Over her head, he met Victoria's eyes. She looked worried. She'll be back, Victoria said quietly. With lawyers. I know. What are you going to do? Ethan looked down at his daughter, at the life they'd built here, at everything that mattered. Whatever it takes. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running through worst-case scenarios. Amanda had money now. A stable home. A husband with a good job. On paper, she looked like the better option. On paper, Ethan looked like a transient contractor living in a rented trailer with no permanent plans. A judge might see it that way. Might decide Maya would be better off in Seattle. The thought made him feel sick. Around 2 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went outside. The clearing was quiet. The barn and workshop dark shapes against the starlit sky. He walked without thinking, ending up at the workshop door. Light spilled from beneath it. Someone was inside. He pushed the door open and found Victoria sitting at the workbench, a laptop open in front of her, surrounded by papers. Can't sleep either? She asked, without looking up. No, I'm looking into custody laws, trying to figure out what Amanda might argue and how to counter it. Ethan walked over, looking at the screen. Legal jargon filled the page, dense and incomprehensible. You don't have to do this. I know. This isn't your fight. Victoria finally looked at him. Yes, it is. You and Maya, you're part of this now. Part of what we're building. If someone's trying to take that away, then it's my fight too. Ethan didn't know what to say. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and looked at the legal documents she'd been reading. What did you find? He asked. That it's complicated. She has visitation rights, but you have primary custody. As long as you can prove you're providing a stable environment, she can't take Maya away. But stable is subjective. And living in a rental trailer probably doesn't count. Not to a court, no. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the problem pressing down on both of them. Finally, Victoria spoke again. What if you moved into the barn? Ethan looked at her. What? The upstairs is finished. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a small kitchen. It was supposed to be storage, but we could convert it. Make it livable. A real home. That would show stability. Victoria, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a solution. You and Maya move into the barn. I pay you a salary for managing the timber operation. And suddenly you have permanent housing and steady employment. On paper, you look a lot more stable. Ethan stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. It made sense. It would solve the immediate problem, but it also meant getting even more entangled in Victoria's life, in this project, in whatever they were building together. What do you get out of this? He asked. A project manager I trust, and the chance to keep the people I care about from getting screwed over. The people you care about. Victoria held his gaze. Yes. Something passed between them then, something that had been building since that first day in the clearing. An acknowledgement. A crossing of a line they'd both been dancing around. Okay, Ethan said. We'll do it. Okay. They worked through the rest of the night, drafting plans to convert the barn's second floor, calculating costs, preparing documentation that would prove Ethan had stable housing and employment. By the time the sun came up, they had a strategy. It wasn't perfect. It might not even work. But it was something. When the crew arrived that morning, Ethan put them to work on the conversion immediately. They built walls, installed fixtures, ran electrical lines. Within a week, the upstairs had been transformed into a small apartment. 2 bedrooms, one for Ethan, one for Maya, a bathroom with a real shower, a kitchen with a stove and refrigerator. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Maya loved it. She claimed her room immediately, decorating it with sketches and collected stones and the piece of scrap wood she'd been carrying since day one. At night, she'd sit at the window, looking out at the forest, and tell Ethan about the constellations she was learning to identify. "This is better than the trailer," she said one night. "Yeah? Yeah, this feels permanent, like we're really staying. We are really staying. Promise?" Ethan looked at his daughter, at her hopeful face, and made a promise he intended to keep. Promise. Amanda's lawyer sent a letter 2 weeks later, requesting a formal custody review. They claimed Ethan's living situation was unstable and potentially dangerous for a child. They wanted Maya placed in Amanda's care pending the review. Ethan hired his own lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in family law. She was sharp and no nonsense, and after reviewing the situation, she was optimistic. "You have a strong case," she told Ethan. "You have stable housing, steady employment, and 3 years of primary custody without incident. The fact that your ex-wife hasn't attempted contact in that time works in your favor. What about the location? We're pretty remote." Remote isn't inherently bad. Maya's enrolled in the local school district, she's healthy and happy, and she's stated clearly that she wants to stay with you. That matters. "So we'll win?" Sarah hesitated. "Family court is unpredictable, but I think you have a very good chance." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks of waiting, 6 weeks of uncertainty. Ethan threw himself into work, trying not to think about what would happen if the judge sided with Amanda. Trying not to imagine Maya being forced to move to Seattle, to live with a mother who'd abandoned her. Victoria noticed. She always noticed. "You're going to make yourself sick," she said one afternoon, watching him work through lunch for the 3rd day in a row. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're terrified." Ethan stopped, hammer in hand, and looked at her. "Yeah, I am. You're going to win." "You don't know that." "I do. Because you're a good father, and because Maya loves you, and because no judge in their right mind would take a happy, healthy child away from a parent who's been there for her every single day. Courts don't always make sense." "No, but this one will." Ethan wanted to believe her. He really did. The weeks crawled by. The timber operation started taking shape, with regular orders coming in from local contractors and furniture makers. The collective was becoming real, becoming viable. Victoria hired 2 part-time employees to help with milling and processing. The property buzzed with activity. And through it all, Ethan tried to be normal for Maya. Tried to act like everything was fine. But at night, lying awake in his room in the barn, he felt the fear gnawing at him. The possibility that everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for, could be taken away. Victoria found him on one of those sleepless nights, sitting outside the barn, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without asking. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about." "Ethan," he exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking about what happens if I lose. If the judge decides Maya's better off with Amanda. How do I explain that to her? How do I tell her that loving someone isn't enough?" "You won't have to, because you're not going to lose." "You keep saying that, because it's true." Victoria turned to face him, her expression fierce. "You are the best father I've ever seen. You've built a life for that girl out of nothing. You've given her stability and love and a home. No court is going to take that away. You can't promise that." "No. But I can promise that if they try, I'll fight them with everything I have." Ethan looked at her, at this woman who'd become so much more than a business partner, and felt something shift. Something that had been locked away for years, protected and guarded, finally breaking free. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why does this matter so much to you?" Victoria's eyes were steady. "Because you matter, both of you, and I'm tired of watching people I care about get hurt by people who don't." Ethan didn't think. He just reached out and pulled her close, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to shake him loose. Victoria's arms came around him, and they sat there in the darkness, 2 people who'd built something impossible and were refusing to let it fall apart. After a long time, Victoria pulled back slightly, just enough to look at him. "We're going to win this." "Together?" "Together." And for the first time in weeks, Ethan believed it. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in mid-October in a county courthouse 40 miles from the mountain. Ethan woke at 4, unable to sleep, his stomach twisted in knots. He showered, dressed in the one suit he owned, and checked on Maya. She was still asleep, curled up under her blanket with her sketchbook beside her pillow. He watched her for a moment, memorizing the piece on her face, before heading downstairs. Victoria was already in the kitchen, making coffee. She'd insisted on coming to the hearing, on being there for support, even though she had no official role in the proceedings. She was dressed in a navy blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back, looking every bit the successful businesswoman she'd once been. "You ready?" she asked, handing him a cup. "No." "Good answer." She took a sip of her own coffee. "Sarah said to be there by 8:30. We should leave by 7 to account for traffic." "Maya's still asleep. Torres is coming at 7:15 to stay with her. He'll get her to school." Ethan nodded, grateful. Victoria had thought of everything, handled all the details he couldn't focus on. Over the past weeks, she'd become his anchor, the person who kept him grounded when everything felt like it was falling apart. They drove down the mountain in Victoria's car, the silence between them heavy with unspoken worry. Ethan stared out the window, watching the landscape change from dense forest to rolling hills to suburban sprawl. The courthouse sat in the center of a small city, a gray stone building that looked like it had been standing for 100 years. Sarah Chen met them in the lobby. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 courtrooms. "How are you holding up?" she asked Ethan. "I've been better." "That's honest. I like honest." She gestured toward a bench. "Let's sit. I want to go over a few things before we go in." They sat, and Sarah pulled out a folder. "Amanda's lawyer is going to argue that your living situation is unstable. They'll point to the fact that you're living on property you don't own, in a structure that was recently converted from a barn, in a remote location. They'll question your employment stability and suggest that Maya would be better off in a traditional home environment." "And our counter?" Ethan asked. "We emphasize your 3 years of primary custody without incident. We show that you have stable employment with a growing business, that Maya is thriving academically and socially, and most importantly, that she wants to stay with you. We also highlight that Amanda has had minimal contact for 3 years and only initiated this custody review after learning about your current living situation." "She's doing this out of spite," Victoria said. Sarah glanced at her. "Probably, but we can't say that in court. We stick to facts." The courtroom was smaller than Ethan had expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, a judge's bench that dominated the front of the room. Amanda was already there with her lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he billed by the minute. Amanda had dressed conservatively, her hair styled perfectly, her makeup subtle. She looked like someone who had her life together, someone stable. Ethan felt sick. The judge entered, and everyone stood. She was an older woman with gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression giving nothing away. She sat, reviewed some papers, then looked up. "This is a custody review hearing for Maya Cole, currently age 11. Primary custody is held by the father, Ethan Cole. The mother, Amanda Cole, is requesting a modification of the custody arrangement. Let's begin." Amanda's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of a concerned mother who had gotten her life together and wanted to provide a stable home for her daughter. He described the house in Seattle, the good school district, the supportive stepfather. Then he turned his attention to Ethan's situation. "Your Honor, while Mr. Cole clearly cares for his daughter, his current living arrangement raises serious concerns. He resides in a converted barn on property he does not own, in an isolated mountain location 30 miles from the nearest town. His employment is with a startup timber collective that has been operational for less than 3 months. There is no long-term stability, no guarantee that this situation will last." Sarah stood. "Objection. Mr. Cole has a formal employment contract in permanent housing. The business is licensed and operational with multiple contracts already in place." The judge held up a hand. "I'll review all documentation. Continue." Amanda's lawyer presented photos of the property, making it look more primitive than it was. He emphasized the isolation, the lack of nearby medical facilities, the distance from Maya's school. He made it sound dangerous. Then it was Sarah's turn. She methodically dismantled every argument, presenting documentation of Ethan's employment contract, photos of the converted living space that showed it was modern and comfortable, testimonials from Maya's teachers praising her academic performance and adjustment. She highlighted Amanda's 3 years of absence, the lack of child support payments, the broken promises to visit. "Your Honor, this isn't about providing a better home for Maya. This is about a parent who abandoned her daughter trying to assuage her guilt by disrupting a stable, loving environment. Maya is thriving with her father. She has explicitly stated she wants to remain in his custody. To remove her from that environment would be cruel and unnecessary. The judge made notes, her expression still unreadable. Then she looked at both lawyers. "I'd like to speak with Maya, alone, in chambers." Ethan's heart stopped. He looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. This was expected. The judge would want to hear from Maya directly, without parental pressure. "We'll adjourn for 30 minutes while I conduct the interview," the judge said. Everyone stood. The judge disappeared into her chambers. Ethan walked out into the hallway, his legs shaky. Victoria was right behind him. "This is good," she said. "Maya's smart. She'll tell the truth." What if she's scared? What if she says the wrong thing? She won't. She knows what she wants. Ethan wanted to believe that. But the thought of his daughter in that office, being questioned by a judge about whether she wanted to live with him or her mother, made him feel like he was drowning. The 30 minutes stretched into an hour. When the bailiff finally called them back in, Ethan's hands were shaking. He sat down trying to read the judge's face. Still nothing. The judge settled into her seat and picked up her notes. "I've spoken with Maya at length. She's an articulate, intelligent child who has very clear feelings about her living situation. She expressed that she's happy with her father, that she feels safe and cared for, and that she does not wish to move to Seattle. She also expressed that while she doesn't harbor ill will toward her mother, she doesn't have a relationship with her and isn't interested in building one at this time." Amanda's face went pale. Her lawyer started to object, but the judge cut him off. "I've reviewed all the documentation provided by both parties. Mr. Cole has demonstrated stable employment and housing. The living situation, while unconventional, meets all safety standards and provides an appropriate environment for a child. Maya's academic and social development have been excellent under her father's care. Most importantly, Maya herself has clearly stated her preference." The judge looked at Amanda. "Ms. Cole, I understand you may have regrets about your past decisions, but 3 years of minimal contact cannot be undone by a sudden interest in custody. If you wish to rebuild a relationship with your daughter, that is your right, but it will happen on Maya's terms, with her consent, and it will not involve removing her from a stable home." She turned to Ethan. "Mr. Cole, primary custody remains with you. Visitation rights for Miss Cole are upheld per the original agreement, but will only be exercised if Maya agrees. This court sees no reason to modify the existing arrangement." The gavel came down. Ethan couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he'd just heard. Then Sarah was shaking his hand, congratulating him, and Victoria was there, her eyes bright with relief, and he realized it was over. They'd won. Amanda and her lawyer left without a word. Ethan stood in the empty courtroom, still trying to believe it was real. "You okay?" Victoria asked. "I don't know. Ask me in an hour." Sarah packed up her briefcase. "Congratulations, Ethan. You're a good father. The judge saw that." "Thank you for everything. Just doing my job." She smiled. "But for what it's worth, this was one of the easier cases I've had. When a child is that clear about what they want, and the parent has done everything right, it's pretty straightforward." They walked out of the courthouse into bright October sunlight. Ethan stood on the steps, breathing deeply, feeling like the weight that had been crushing him for weeks had finally lifted. Victoria stood beside him. "We should celebrate." "Yeah, we should. What do you want to do?" Ethan looked at her, at this woman who'd stood by him through everything, who'd fought for him and Maya like they were her own family. "I want to go home. Pick up Maya. Tell her it's over." "That sounds perfect." They drove back up the mountain, the landscape reversing itself, suburbs giving way to hills, giving way to forest. When they pulled into the clearing, Maya was sitting on the barn steps with Torres, throwing pebbles at a tin can. She looked up as they approached, her face anxious. Ethan got out of the car and walked over to her. "Hey, kiddo." "What happened?" Her voice was small. "We won. You're staying with me." Maya's face crumpled, and she threw herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist and holding on tight. Ethan hugged her back, feeling her shake with silent sobs of relief. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I know. Me too. But it's over now." "She can't make me leave?" "No, never." Maya pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Good. Because I told the judge I'd run away if she tried." Despite everything, Ethan laughed. "You didn't." "I did. She thought it was funny." Victoria came over, smiling. "You did great, Maya." "You think so?" "I know so. You were brave." Maya looked between them, then asked the question Ethan had been dreading. Is Victoria staying too? Ethan glanced at Victoria, unsure how to answer. They hadn't talked about what came next, about what they were to each other, beyond business partners and friends. Victoria crouched down to Maya's level. Do you want me to stay? Yeah, I really do. Then I'm staying. Maya grinned and hugged her. Over his daughter's head, Victoria's eyes met Ethan's. Something passed between them, a promise neither of them had spoken, but both understood. They were in this together now. All of them. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Ethan and Victoria sat on the barn steps, watching the stars come out. The air was cold, autumn settling into the mountains with serious intent. Winter would come soon, bringing snow and shorter days and its own set of challenges. You really meant that? Ethan asked. About staying? Yeah, I did. Even though the custody thing is over, you don't have to keep fighting for us. Victoria turned to look at him. I'm not fighting for you anymore, Ethan. I'm fighting with you. There's a difference. What does that mean? She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. It means I'm not doing this because you need help. I'm doing this because I want to. Because this place, this project, you and Maya, all of it matters to me. It's become more than just saving my father's legacy. It's become my life. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Victoria, let me finish. She took a breath. I know this is complicated. I know we started as a business arrangement and it's turned into something else, and neither of us really knows what to do with that. But I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Not because I'm stuck here, but because I don't want to be anywhere else. Ethan stared at her, at this fierce, brilliant woman who'd shown up in his life and turned everything upside down. He thought about the past months, the way they'd fought and built and survived together, the way she'd become essential, someone he couldn't imagine his life without. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. Do what? This. Whatever this is, I've spent the last 3 years focused on Maya, on keeping us afloat. I don't know how to let someone else in. Then don't think of it as letting me in. Think of it as building something new, together. Ethan looked at her, at the honesty in her eyes, and made a decision. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. It was a small gesture, simple, but it felt monumental. Together, he said. Victoria smiled, and they sat there in the cold October night, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. The next months passed in a blur of work and routine and small moments that accumulated into something larger. The Timber Collective grew, taking on more contracts, hiring more workers. They built 2 more structures on the property, a storage facility and a small retail space where they could sell finished products directly to customers. The operation became profitable, then successful, then thriving. Ethan found himself settling into a rhythm he'd never experienced before. Work that felt meaningful. A home that felt permanent. A partnership with Victoria that deepened with every shared decision, every late-night planning session, every quiet moment stolen between the chaos of running a business. They didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic moments, just a gradual intertwining of their lives, so natural that Ethan barely noticed it happening until one day he realized Victoria had become the first person he thought of in the morning and the last person he talked to at night. Maya noticed too. She started calling Victoria by her first name instead of Ms. Hale. Started including her in stories about her day at school. Started asking if Victoria would come to her concerts and school events. Victoria always said yes. Winter came hard that year, dumping 3 feet of snow on the property and cutting them off from town for days at a time. They learned to plan better, to stock supplies, to handle the isolation. Maya loved it, building snow forts and sledding down hills on pieces of scrap metal. Ethan and Victoria spent evenings by the fire in the barn, planning the next phase of expansion while Maya did homework at the table. It felt like a family. A strange, unconventional family that hadn't existed 6 months ago, but a family nonetheless. In January, the property got an unexpected visitor. Not Amanda this time, but a representative from a national magazine that wanted to do a feature on sustainable timber operations. They'd heard about the collective through social media, through the coverage of the barn restoration, and the fight with the developer. They wanted to tell the story. Victoria was hesitant at first. We don't need the publicity. It could bring in more business, Ethan pointed out, or it could turn us into a spectacle. People coming up here to gawk at the barn that was almost demolished. Is that so bad? If it gets people interested in sustainable practices? Victoria sighed. I just don't want this place to become something it's not. We built this for us. For people who actually care about the work. Then we tell them that. We control the narrative. They agreed to the interview, and a week later, a photographer and journalist showed up, spending 3 days documenting the operation. They interviewed Ethan, Victoria, the crew. They took photos of the barn, the workshop, the forest. They even interviewed Maya, who talked about her treehouse and the birdhouse she'd finally finished, and how much she loved living in the mountains. When the article came out 2 months later, it was better than they'd hoped. It focused on the work, the craftsmanship, the sustainability model. It mentioned the barn restoration only briefly as context for how the collective began. The photos were beautiful, capturing the property in winter light, making everything look both rustic and professional. Orders tripled overnight. The phone rang constantly. They had to hire more workers, expand operations, turn away contracts they couldn't fulfill. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and exactly what they'd been working toward. One night in March, after a particularly brutal 16-hour day, Ethan found Victoria in the workshop at midnight, still working on inventory spreadsheets. You need to sleep, he said. So do you. I just did the final walkthrough. Everything's locked up. Victoria saved her work and closed her laptop. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but there was satisfaction in her expression too. We did it. We actually built something that works. We did. I didn't think it was possible. When you first got here, when I asked you to rebuild the barn, I thought we might pull off a miracle and save the property. I never imagined this. Ethan sat down beside her. Neither did I. Are you glad you stayed? He thought about that. About the life he'd had before, the jobs that blurred together, the loneliness he'd pretended was independence. And he thought about now. About waking up in the barn with Maya down the hall and Victoria somewhere nearby. About work that mattered and a future that felt real. Yeah, he said. I am. Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in comfortable silence. Somewhere outside, an owl called. The workshop smelled like sawdust and wood stain, familiar and grounding. Ethan? Victoria said after a while. Yeah? I love you. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, a certainty he hadn't felt in years. I love you too. Victoria lifted her head to look at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. Happy tears. Good. Because I was starting to think I was the only one. You're not. You haven't been for a while. How long? Ethan thought back, trying to pinpoint the moment. Was it during the barn restoration, when she'd pulled him off the scaffolding during the storm? During the fight with the developer, when she'd stood beside him against impossible odds? During the custody hearing, when she'd been there without being asked? I don't know, he admitted. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about the barn or the business. It became about you. Victoria kissed him then, soft and tentative, like they were both learning something new. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. We're doing this? She asked. Yeah, we're doing this. It's going to be complicated. Everything we do is complicated. Fair point. They sat there for a while longer, then Victoria stood and held out her hand. Come on, let's go home. Home. The word felt right. Ethan took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. They walked out of the workshop together, across the clearing to the barn, where Maya was asleep upstairs and the life they'd built was waiting for them. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in patches, revealing mud and new grass underneath. The property transformed again, from stark winter whites to vibrant greens. The crew expanded the milling operation, bringing in new equipment and building additional storage. They hired a marketing person to handle the influx of orders and a part-time accountant to manage the books. Maya turned 12 in April, and they threw a party at the barn with her school friends and Torres and the crew. Victoria made a cake that was lopsided but delicious. Ethan gave Maya a set of professional woodworking tools, and she immediately started planning her next project. That night, after everyone had left and Maya was in bed, Ethan and Victoria stood in the barn looking at the mess of decorations and empty plates. We should clean this up, Victoria said. We should. Neither of them moved. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Always. Do you ever regret it, walking away from your old life? Ethan thought about his office in town, the jobs he'd lined up, the predictable future he'd traded for uncertainty in the mountains. No, not once. Even with everything that happened, the fight with the developer, the custody battle, all of it, especially because of all that. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions. Working, raising Maya, surviving. I wasn't living. And now? Now I'm living. Victoria smiled and Ethan pulled her close, holding her in the middle of the messy barn they'd saved together. Outside, the forest was waking up, birds calling in the darkness, night giving way to the promise of morning. They'd built something here. Not just a barn or a business, but a life. A real one, with all its complications and imperfections and unexpected beauty. And standing there with Victoria in his arms, Ethan knew he wouldn't change a single thing. The last major challenge came in May, unexpected and brutal. A wildfire started 20 miles south, driven by drought and high winds. Within 2 days, it had spread to 15,000 acres, forcing evacuations across the county. The authorities issued a warning for their area. Voluntary for now, but that could change. Ethan stood in the clearing, watching smoke darken the southern sky, and felt fear like ice in his veins. "We need to evacuate," Victoria said. She was already packing documents, gathering important papers. "Get Maya ready. We can be out in an hour." "And go where?" "Anywhere that's not on fire." Ethan looked at the barn, the workshop, everything they'd built. "We can't just leave." "We can and we will. This isn't worth dying for. It's worth fighting for." Victoria stopped packing and turned to face him. "Ethan, no. We are not doing this. We are not risking our lives for buildings. These aren't just buildings. This is our home, our business, everything we've worked for. And it means nothing if we're dead." They stared at each other, the argument hanging between them. Then Maya appeared in the doorway, her backpack already on, her face scared. "Are we leaving?" she asked. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the fear in her eyes, and felt the fight drain out of him. Victoria was right. Nothing here was worth risking Maya's life. "Yeah," he said. "We're leaving." They packed quickly, loading essential documents and personal belongings into Victoria's car and Ethan's truck. Torres and the crew were already gone, evacuated hours earlier. The clearing felt abandoned, hollow. As they prepared to leave, Ethan took one last look at the barn. It stood solid and proud against the smoke-darkened sky, a testament to everything they'd endured. He thought about the 30 days they'd spent rebuilding it, the fights they'd won to keep it, and he thought about letting it burn. The unfairness of it made him want to scream. "Come on," Victoria said gently. "We have to go." They drove down the mountain in convoy, Ethan in the truck with Maya, Victoria following behind. The road was clogged with other evacuees, everyone fleeing the advancing fire. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. Maya kept looking back through the rear window, watching the mountains disappear behind them. "Will it be okay?" she asked. Ethan wanted to lie, wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but he'd promised himself he'd always tell her the truth. "I don't know," he said. They stayed in a motel 30 miles away, watching news coverage of the fire on a small TV. The blaze continued to spread, consuming everything in its path. Evacuation orders expanded. Firefighters worked around the clock. The coverage showed helicopter footage of burning forests, homes reduced to ash, entire communities destroyed. Victoria paced the motel room, phone pressed to her ear, trying to get updates from the fire department. No one could tell her anything definite. The fire was unpredictable. Conditions were changing by the hour. On the third night, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going back." Victoria lowered her phone. "No, you're not. I need to see what's happening. They won't let you through. The roads are closed." "Then I'll hike in." "Ethan, that's insane." "Maybe, but I can't sit here doing nothing while everything we built burns." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. I'm coming with you. Someone needs to stay with Maya. Torres can stay with her. He's already checked in twice today, offering to help." They called Torres, who drove over immediately. He looked at them like they were crazy, which they probably were, but he didn't try to stop them. "Be careful," he said. "And if you die up there, I'm killing you." They drove as far as the roadblocks would allow, then hiked in on foot, following trails Ethan had used for timber scouting. The smoke grew thicker as they climbed, stinging their eyes, making it hard to breathe. They tied bandanas over their faces and kept going. It took 4 hours to reach the property. When they finally broke through the tree line into the clearing, Ethan stopped dead. The barn was still standing, blackened, scorched on one side where flames had gotten close, but standing. The workshop, too, though part of the roof was gone. The forest around them had burned, trees reduced to charred skeletons, the ground covered in ash, but the structures they'd built had survived. Victoria stood beside him, staring in disbelief. How? Ethan walked closer, inspecting the damage. The fire had swept through, burning hot and fast, but the clearing they'd maintained around the buildings had acted as a fire break. The concrete foundation, the metal roof, the careful spacing, all of it had worked, had saved their home. "We built it to last," Ethan said quietly. They spent the rest of the day assessing damage, putting out small fires, making sure nothing would reignite. The fire had passed, moving east toward less populated areas. They were safe now, scarred but safe. As the sun set, they sat on the barn steps, covered in soot and ash, exhausted beyond measure. The landscape around them was devastated, but the core of what they'd built remained. "We made it," Victoria said. "We did." Again. Ethan laughed despite himself. "Yeah, again." Victoria leaned against him, and they watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the ash-covered clearing in shades of orange and red. It looked like the end of the world, but it wasn't. It was just another test they'd survived, another impossible thing they'd made possible. When they brought Maya back to the property 3 days later, she cried. Not from sadness, but from relief. She stood in the ash-covered clearing, looking at the barn that had somehow survived, and the tears just came. Ethan held her while she sobbed, Victoria's hand on his shoulder, the three of them standing in what looked like a war zone, but felt like victory. "I thought it was gone," Maya said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I thought we lost everything." "We didn't," Ethan said. "We're still here." The cleanup took weeks. They hauled away burned debris, replanted scorched areas, repaired the damaged section of the workshop roof. The forest would take years to recover, maybe decades, but the land itself was resilient. New growth was already pushing through the ash, small green shoots that refused to give up. Torres and the crew came back to help. They worked without pay at first, just showing up every morning with tools and determination. When Ethan tried to refuse their help, Torres cut him off. "This place matters to us too," he said. "You gave us work when nobody else would. You built something real here, so we're helping you rebuild it." End of discussion. Ethan didn't argue after that. The insurance payout helped, though it didn't cover everything. They'd lost inventory, equipment, weeks of work. But the core structures had survived, and that was what mattered. They could rebuild the rest. Victoria threw herself into the work with an intensity that worried Ethan. She was up before dawn, working until midnight, pushing herself harder than she'd pushed during the 30-day sprint. One night he found her in the workshop, sitting on the floor surrounded by financial reports, her face streaked with tears. "Hey," he said gently, sitting beside her. "What's going on?" "The numbers don't work." Her voice was hollow. "Even with the insurance money, we're short. We can rebuild, but we can't sustain operations while we do it. We'll have to shut down for at least 3 months, and we'll lose most of our contracts. By the time we're operational again, we'll have to start over from scratch." Ethan looked at the reports, at the red numbers that told a story he didn't want to hear. "How short are we?" 70,000, maybe 80. He whistled low. "That's a lot." "I know." Victoria wiped her eyes. "I could sell some assets. My car, some investments I kept in reserve. But it still won't be enough." "What about a loan?" "I already owe the bank everything. They won't extend more credit." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the problem pressing down on them. Then Ethan said, "What if we went public with it?" Victoria looked at him. "What do you mean?" The magazine article brought in a lot of attention. "What if we tell people what happened, ask for help, crowdfunding or something?" "I'm not begging for money." "It's not begging, it's asking people who believe in what we're doing to invest in it. We give them something in return. First, access to products, workshops, whatever. We turn it into a community thing." Victoria shook her head. "I don't know, that feels like giving up control." "It's not giving up control, it's sharing ownership with people who care." Ethan took her hand. "We can't do this alone anymore. Maybe we were never supposed to. She looked at him for a long moment, then down at the reports. You really think it would work? I think it's worth trying. They launched the campaign 2 weeks later. Victoria wrote the description herself, telling the story of the barn, the collective, the fire. She was honest about the challenges, about the money they needed, about what they were trying to build. She didn't sugarcoat anything or make promises she couldn't keep. The response was overwhelming. Within 24 hours, they'd raised $20,000. Within a week, $50,000. People from across the country contributed, some giving $5, some giving $500. They left comments about supporting sustainable practices, about believing in small businesses, about wanting to be part of something that mattered. By the end of the month, they'd exceeded their goal by $15,000. Victoria cried when the campaign closed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, watching the final total climb. Ethan stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, equally stunned. We did it, she whispered. No, they did it. All those people who believed in us. In us, she corrected. They believed in us. With the funding secured, they rebuilt faster than Ethan thought possible. They upgraded equipment, expanded the workshop, hired back the crew at better wages. They started offering workshops like Victoria had originally planned, teaching traditional woodworking to people who wanted to learn. The classes filled up immediately, people driving from hours away to spend weekends learning to mill lumber and build furniture. Maya started helping with the classes, showing kids her age how to use basic tools safely. She was good at it, patient, and encouraging in a way that surprised Ethan. She'd grown up so much in the past year, becoming more confident, more sure of herself. One Saturday afternoon, while Victoria was teaching a furniture-making workshop and Maya was helping a group of teenagers build birdhouses, Ethan stood outside the barn watching it all. The clearing was full of people, full of noise and activity and life. The forest behind them was still recovering, still scarred from the fire, but the property itself was thriving. Torres walked over, holding 2 beers. He handed one to Ethan. Hell of a thing you built here, Torres said. We built it, Ethan corrected. All of us. Yeah, but you started it, you and Victoria. You took a dying barn and turned it into this. He gestured at the workshop, the people, the whole operation. That takes vision and guts. Ethan took a sip of his beer. I didn't have vision when I got here. I just had a job. And now? Now I have a home. Torres nodded, understanding. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the workshop until Victoria emerged, laughing at something one of her students had said. She caught Ethan's eye and smiled, and he felt that same certainty he'd felt months ago. This was where he belonged. In August, Maya started 7th grade at the local middle school. She'd made friends over the summer, kids from town who'd come up to the property for workshops or just to hang out. She was different now from the quiet kid who'd sat in the truck a year ago, watching her dad inspect a dying barn. She walked taller, smiled easier, talked about her future like it was something she could shape instead of something that happened to her. One night at dinner, she announced she wanted to be an architect. I want to design buildings like the barn, she said, places that last. That means something. Victoria grinned. That's a great goal. Will you help me? Teach me stuff? Absolutely. Ethan watched them plan out a learning schedule, Victoria promising to teach Maya drafting and design principles, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not just for Victoria, but for this whole life they'd stumbled into. He'd spent years thinking his job was to survive, to keep Maya safe and fed and clothed. He'd never considered that he deserved more than that they both did. But here they were, not just surviving, living. The collective's first anniversary came in October, exactly 1 year after the barn had passed inspection. They threw a party, inviting everyone who'd helped along the way. The crew, the workshop students, the people who'd contributed to the crowdfunding campaign, even Sarah Chen and some of the reporters who'd covered their story. The clearing filled with people, music playing from speakers set up in the workshop, tables loaded with food. Ethan stood on the barn steps looking out at the crowd, and Victoria appeared beside him with 2 glasses of wine. Speech time, she said, handing him one. I'm not making a speech. You have to. You're the project manager. You're the owner. We're partners. We do this together. Ethan looked at her, at the certainty in her expression, and realized she was right. They were partners. In business, in life, in everything that mattered. They stood together and Victoria clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, turning to face them. "Thank you all for being here," Victoria said. "A year ago, this property was about to be foreclosed on. The barn was days away from being torn down. I'd lost everything trying to save it, and I was out of options. Then Ethan showed up. She glanced at him, and he saw emotion in her eyes. He didn't have to take the job. It was impossible, underpaid, and I was difficult to work with, but he took it anyway. And in 30 days, we built something I didn't think was possible." "We also nearly killed each other," Ethan added, and the crowd laughed. "True," Victoria agreed, "but we didn't. And when the 30 days were over, instead of walking away like any sane person would, he stayed. And together we built this." She gestured at the property, at the barn and workshop, and all the structures they'd added. "This collective isn't just about timber or furniture. It's about proving that you can build something meaningful if you're willing to fight for it. That you don't have to accept what the world tells you is possible. That community matters. That persistence matters. That sometimes the impossible things are worth doing precisely because they're impossible." People clapped and Victoria raised her glass. "To everyone who believed in us, who fought with us, who helped us rebuild when everything burned down, thank you." "To second chances," Ethan added, "and the people brave enough to take them." They drank, and the party continued into the night. Later, after most people had left and Maya was asleep upstairs, Ethan and Victoria sat by a fire pit in the clearing, watching embers drift into the dark sky. "You think we'll still be doing this in 10 years?" Victoria asked. "Doing what? The collective?" "All of it. This life." Ethan thought about it, about the challenges that would come, the problems they couldn't predict, the disasters they'd have to survive, about getting older, about Maya growing up and leaving eventually, about the uncertainty that came with building something from nothing. "Yeah," he said. "I think we will." "How can you be sure?" "I can't. But I know we'll try. And that's enough." Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you stayed." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, and Ethan thought about the path that had led him here. The failed jobs, the divorce, the years of just getting by. He'd thought that was all his life would ever be, a series of struggles with no real purpose. But he'd been wrong. Purpose wasn't something you found. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, alongside people who mattered. And sometimes the best things in life came from the hardest fights. In November, Amanda called. Ethan almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello?" "Ethan, it's Amanda." Her voice was different than he remembered, quieter, less certain. "What do you want?" I wanted to apologize for the custody hearing, for everything. I shouldn't have tried to take Maya from you. I was angry and I handled it badly." Ethan didn't respond right away. Part of him wanted to hang up, to refuse this olive branch she was extending. But another part, the part that had learned something about forgiveness over the past year, stayed on the line. "Why are you calling?" he asked. "Because I've been in therapy, working through a lot of things. And my therapist asked me what I wanted my relationship with Maya to look like. And I realized, I don't know. I threw away 3 years because I was scared and ashamed, and now I don't know how to get them back." "You can't get them back. That's not how time works." "I know, but maybe I could start over. If Maya wanted to. No pressure, no court fights, just a chance to be in her life again, on her terms." Ethan looked toward the barn where Maya was upstairs doing homework. "That's not my decision to make. It's hers." "I know, but I wanted to ask you first. If you think it's a terrible idea, I'll respect that." Ethan thought about Maya, about the confident kid she'd become, about how she'd learned to stand up for herself, to know what she wanted. She didn't need protection from her mother anymore. She could make this choice herself. "I'll ask her," he said, "but whatever she decides, you have to respect it. No guilt trips, no manipulation. She gets to decide what relationship, if any, she wants with you." "I understand. Thank you, Ethan." He hung up and sat for a while, processing the conversation. Then he went upstairs and knocked on Maya's door. "Yeah?" she called. He opened the door. She was sprawled on her bed with a math textbook, looking annoyed. "Your mom called." Maya sat up, her expression immediately guarded. "What did she want?" "To apologize. And to ask if you'd be willing to talk to her sometime. No pressure, No expectations. Just a phone call if you want. Maya was quiet for a long moment, chewing her lip. Do you think I should? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. If you want to talk to her, we'll make it happen. If you don't, that's okay too. What if I talk to her and I still don't want a relationship? Then you tell her that, and she has to accept it. Maya nodded slowly. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. 3 days later, Maya told him she wanted to make the call. They sat together on the barn steps while she dialed, Ethan close enough to support her but far enough to give her privacy. He listened to her side of the conversation, heard her voice stay steady and clear as she talked to her mother. When she hung up 20 minutes later, she looked thoughtful. How was it? Ethan asked. Weird. She apologized a lot, asked about my life. Seemed like she actually cared. What do you think? I think maybe we can talk sometimes, like once a month or something, but I don't want to visit Seattle, and I don't want her showing up here unless I say it's okay. That sounds reasonable. Is it bad that I don't miss her? That I'm fine with her not being in my life? Ethan pulled her close. No, kiddo, that's not bad. That's honest. And honest is always okay. Maya leaned against him. I'm glad I have you. And Victoria, that's enough family for me. We're glad we have you too. Christmas came with snow, blanketing the property in white and making everything look clean and new. They decorated the barn with lights and garland, set up a tree in the living area upstairs. Victoria's parents came to visit, driving up from California to see what their daughter had built. They were skeptical at first, clearly worried about her decision to invest everything in a timber collective in the mountains. But after spending a few days seeing the operation, meeting the crew, watching Victoria work, they softened. Her father pulled Ethan aside on the last day of their visit. Take care of her, he said. It wasn't a request. I will, Ethan promised. She's different than she was before. Happier. That's because of you. It's because of this place, what we built together. Victoria's father nodded. Just don't let her work herself to death. She has a tendency to do that. I noticed. They shook hands, and Ethan realized he was being given a father's blessing. It felt significant. Right. On Christmas morning, Maya gave Victoria a framed drawing she'd made of the barn, detailed and beautiful. Victoria cried when she opened it. I love it, she said, hugging Maya tight. This is going on the wall downstairs. Victoria gave Maya a drafting set, professional quality, with a note promising to teach her everything she knew about design. Maya's squeal of delight filled the barn, and Ethan gave Victoria a key. She looked at it, confused. What's this for? The barn. Officially. I know you own it, but I wanted you to know this is your home, not just your property. Your home. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Ethan, and I was hoping it could be mine too. Officially, if you want. She stared at him, understanding dawning. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you want to build this life together, for real. Not just business partners or people who happen to be living in the same place, but partners in everything. Victoria laughed through her tears. Yes, absolutely yes. Maya cheered, and they had a group hug in the middle of the barn while snow fell outside the windows. It wasn't a traditional proposal, didn't involve a ring or a fancy speech, but it was honest, and that made it perfect. They got married in May, in the clearing in front of the barn. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, Maya serving as the officiant because she'd gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose. The barn stood behind them, solid and proud, a reminder of everything they'd survived. When Maya pronounced them married, everyone cheered. Ethan kissed Victoria while their guests clapped, and he thought about the journey that had brought them here. From strangers to partners to family, from a dying barn to a thriving collective, from survival to something that looked a lot like happiness. Later, at the reception in the workshop, Torres gave a toast. I've worked with Ethan for 15 years, he said, and I've never seen him like this. Happy, settled, like he finally figured out where he belongs. He raised his glass. To Ethan and Victoria, who proved that the impossible stuff is just stuff nobody's tried hard enough yet. Everyone drank, and the party continued into the evening. Maya danced with Victoria's father. The crew told embarrassing stories about the barn restoration. People laughed and ate and celebrated. And Ethan stood to the side for a moment, just watching. Watching his daughter dance, watching his wife smile, watching the community they'd built gather in the space they'd created. Victoria appeared beside him. "You okay?" "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" "About how a year and a half ago I drove up that mountain expecting to tell someone their project was dead. And instead I found this." Victoria took his hand. "Do you believe in fate?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe we just made choices that led us here. Good choices. The best choices." They stood together, watching their wedding reception unfold in the workshop they'd built from nothing. And Ethan realized something fundamental had shifted in him. For years, he'd measured his life in jobs completed, bills paid, problems solved. But those weren't the things that mattered. What mattered was this: the people you chose, the life you built with them, the love you fought for even when it seemed impossible. The barn had taught him that. 30 days of breaking his back to save something that everyone said was doomed had taught him that some things were worth the fight. That impossible was just another word for difficult. That with enough determination and the right people beside you, you could build anything, even a life worth living. Summer brought new challenges and new opportunities. The collective expanded again, purchasing adjacent land that had come up for sale. They built a second workshop, started a furniture line that sold out within weeks, hired more crew. The operation grew beyond anything Victoria had originally envisioned, becoming not just a business, but a model that other communities started replicating. They gave talks at sustainability conferences, hosted visiting groups who wanted to learn their methods. Maya started a blog documenting the collective's growth, writing about sustainable practices and traditional craftsmanship in a way that resonated with her generation. Through it all, Ethan and Victoria worked side by side. They argued sometimes, both too stubborn to back down easily, but they also learned to compromise, to trust each other's instincts, to build something larger than either of them could have created alone. One evening in late August, almost exactly 2 years after Ethan had first driven up that mountain road, he and Victoria sat on the barn steps watching the sunset. Maya was at a friend's house in town. The crew had gone home. The property was quiet. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd walked away that first day?" Victoria asked. "Sometimes, but not often." "What do you think would have happened?" Ethan considered it. "You would have found another contractor. Someone else would have built the barn. Maybe it would have worked out. Maybe not. But we wouldn't be here. Like this." "No, we wouldn't." Victoria leaned against him. "I'm glad you stayed. You've said that before. I'll probably say it 1,000 more times. I'm okay with that." They sat in comfortable silence, and Ethan thought about all the things he'd learned in the past 2 years. That strength wasn't about never failing, but about getting up after you did. That community mattered more than independence. That love wasn't something you fell into, but something you built deliberately, day after day, choice after choice. He thought about the barn behind them, standing solid against the changing sky. It had been a symbol once, a last connection to Victoria's father, a project that represented everything she'd lost. But it had become something else, a home, a business, a foundation for a life neither of them had planned but both had chosen. Some people spent their whole lives looking for purpose, Ethan realized, searching for meaning in work or achievement or acquisition. But purpose wasn't something you found, it was something you created. With your hands, with your choices, with the people you let into your life. The barn wasn't just a structure. It was proof that broken things could be rebuilt, that impossible deadlines could be met, that two people from completely different worlds could come together and create something neither could have imagined alone. It was proof that even when everything seemed lost, even when the odds were against you and the world said to quit, you could keep going, you could fight, you could build. And sometimes, if you were lucky, what you built would be worth every moment of the struggle. Victoria stood, holding out her hand. "Come on, let's go inside." Ethan took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. They walked into the barn together, into the home they'd created from desperation and determination and a refusal to accept defeat. Behind them, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The forest had recovered from the fire, new growth pushing through where old trees had fallen. The clearing buzzed with life, with possibility, with the promise of tomorrow. And the barn stood tall, exactly as it was meant to. Not perfect, not flawless, but solid, real. built to last, just like everything else they'd created together.